July 1957, the Directorate of Military Intelligence, GRU headquarters, Moscow. Colonel Viktor Chebrikov stared at the graining black and white reconnaissance photograph pinned to the corkboard. It was a blurry, high-altitude snatch of an American airfield, likely taken by a brave pilot in a modified Bison bomber or obtained through the breathless handover of a spy in a Vienna park. The subject of the photo was a new American silhouette. Long, angular, brutish. This was the McDonnell F-101 Voodoo. To the untrained eye, it was just another jet in the rapid evolution of the 1950s. But to Chebrikov and the frantic analysts of the Soviet Air Defense Forces, it represented a puzzle that did not fit. The intelligence reports coming across the colonel's desk were contradictory, painting a picture of an aircraft that was technically impressive, but tactically baffled. The data was hard to argue with. The American jet was fast supersonic. It was designed to climb like a rocket and intercept the motherland's bomber fleets before they could cross the Canadian border. But there was a glaring omission in the design that made the Soviet engineers scratch their heads. "Where are the eyes?" Chebrikov muttered, tapping the nose of the aircraft in the photo. The Soviet strategists knew that the future of air combat was guided missiles. They were pouring rubles into their own radar-guided systems. They knew that at Mach 1, a pilot could not aim a gun accurately. They knew that to shoot down a massive Tu-95 bomber flight, you needed precision. You needed a radar to lock onto the target, and a missile to follow that lock. But the intelligence on this new Voodoo suggested it was being fitted with a Hughes fire control system that seemed simplistic. And the armament? The reports whispered about unguided rockets. This was the impossible event, the logical disconnect. The Americans, the leaders in technology, were building a dedicated high-speed interceptor to patrol the frozen north, and they were arming it with weapons that couldn't steer. In the logic of 1957 air combat, firing unguided rockets at a supersonic bomber was like trying to throw a rock at a speeding car while riding a motorcycle. It was a desperate, mathematically improbable tactic. The Soviet generals around the table relaxed. They exchanged looks of cautious optimism. If this was the best, the Americans had a fast plane that had to fly in a straight line and spray dumb rockets hoping for a lucky hit, then the new formations of Soviet bombers were safe. The Tupolev designers had assured the Kremlin that their new electronic jamming suites would blind American radar. If the Americans couldn't lock on, they couldn't shoot. And if this Voodoo was relying on unguided munitions, it was practically harmless against a dispersed formation in bad weather. They were analyzing the weapon, but they were missing the warhead. They saw the dumb rocket. They did not see the physics, shattering secret hidden inside the fuselage. They assumed the Americans were failing. In reality, the Americans had simply decided that aiming was no longer necessary. Before we unravel the terrifying secret that would turn the Arctic sky into a graveyard, make sure you are subscribed to Cold War Impact. We investigate the hidden history and the terrifying technology that kept the world on the edge of the abyss. Click the subscribe button now. The confusion in Moscow was not just about the plane, it was about the shifting philosophy of the enemy. Up until this moment, the aerial game was a duel. A night against a night, a MiG-17 aircraft against an F-86 Sabre. Skill against skill. But the Americans were quietly rewriting the rulebook. They were moving away from the duel and towards something much darker, total erasure. Reports began to trickle in from the Soviet embassy in Washington and listening posts in the Pacific. They spoke of a strange test in the Nevada desert, Operation Plumbob. The seismic sensors had picked up a disturbance, but not on the ground. The atmospheric sniffers had tasted isotopes, but not from a drop. The report lay on the colonel's desk, buried under technical schematics of radar ranges. It mentioned a shot john. It mentioned an air-to-air detonation, but the yield was small, tiny, by thermonuclear standards. Just 1.5 kilotons. To a Soviet nuclear scientist thinking about destroying cities, a 1.5 kiloton warhead was a failure. It was too small to wipe out a factory complex. It was a firecracker compared to the megaton monsters they were designing to level New York. So, they filed the report away. They categorized it as a tactical battlefield experiment, perhaps for use against tank columns or bridges. They did not connect the dots. They did not put the fast, blind Voodoo together with the small, high-altitude explosion. The Soviet mind was trained to expect logical escalation, bigger guns, faster missiles, better radar. They could not conceive that the Americans had solved the accuracy problem by simply deciding to blow up the entire sky. The mood in the Kremlin remained one of aggressive confidence. The production lines for the Tu-16 Badger and the Tu-95 Bear were running day and night. These magnificent beasts were designed to fly high, fly fast, and use their defensive turrets to fend off interceptors. The Soviet doctrine relied on the bomber stream, mass formations that would overwhelm defenses with sheer numbers. If the Americans sent up F-101 Voodoos, the Soviet tail gunners would chew them up. If the Voodoos fired unguided rockets, they would miss. The math was on the side of the Soviet Union. Or so they thought. Deep in the frozen silence of the radar stations along the Arctic coast, the operators watched the blips of American patrols. They saw the Voodoo flying pattern lines. They tracked its speed. It was terrifyingly fast, yes. But it seemed toothless. It was a lion without claws, a hunter without a rifle. The Soviet analysts wrote their assessments. The American F-101 interceptor presents a minimal threat to high-altitude bomber formations due to lack of precision guidance capability. Recommend continued aggressive probing of the DEW line. They had just signed the death warrant for thousands of their own airmen. They were looking at a weapon that didn't need to hit the target. They were looking at the carrier of the AIR-2 Genie. The Genie was not a missile, it was a rocket. It had no brain, it had no guidance fins. It had a solid rocket motor that burned for a few seconds, propelling it to Mach 3. And inside its nose cone sat a W-25 nuclear warhead. The Americans didn't need to hit the Tu-95. They didn't even need to be close to it. They just needed to get the rocket into the same zip code. But in 1957, the Soviet pilots buttoning up their flight suits and walking out to their silver bombers on the tarmac at Engels Air Base had no idea. They looked at the intelligence briefings that mocked the American unguided rockets. They laughed at the primitive American tactics. They climbed into their cockpits, fired up their engines, and turned their noses toward the North Pole, confident that their speed and their electronic jammers would keep them safe. They were flying into a trap that defied the laws of conventional warfare. The mystery was set, the voodoo was waiting, and the fuse was already lit. 1958. The edge of the stratosphere, above the Bering Strait. The Cold War was not a static standoff. It was a rhythmic, terrifying dance. Night after night, the Soviet long-range aviation units played a game of chicken with the North American continent. Yuri, a navigator on a Tu-95 Bear bomber, watched his scope. The massive turboprop engines droned a heavy, vibrating bass note that shook the very rivets of the fuselage. They were skirting the Alaskan Air Defense Identification Zone, waiting for the Americans to react. It was a test of reaction times, a test of nerves. "Contact," Yuri called out over the intercom. "Fast mover, 12 o'clock high." It was the Voodoo. From the cockpit of the Tu-95 bomber, the American interceptor was a silver dart against the dark blue canopy of the upper atmosphere. But the behavior of the American pilot was baffling. Standard aerial doctrine, the rules written in blood during World War II and Korea, dictated that an attacker should maneuver to the 6 o'clock position. You get behind the enemy. You lock your radar on his hot exhaust. You fire a heat-seeking sidewinder or use your cannons. But the F-101 Voodoo did not try to get behind them. It didn't try to turn. It didn't try to outmaneuver the lumbering bomber. Instead, the Voodoo accelerated to Mach 1.5 and flew a direct, unwavering line straight at the nose of the Soviet formation. It was a collision course intercept. To Yuri and his pilot, it looked suicidal. The closure rate was over 2,000 miles per hour. If the American fired a conventional rocket from that angle, the window of opportunity was a fraction of a second, a blink, and they would pass each other. The Soviet crew tensed, waiting for the break, waiting for the tracers. But the Voodoo simply flashed past, rolling away at the last possible second, disappearing into the clouds below. Back at the Zhukovsky Air Base, the debriefing officers were frustrated. "They are not engaging," the intelligence officer said, slamming a file onto the metal table. "They are practicing runs that make no sense. A head-on attack with unguided rockets? It is mathematically impossible to hit a maneuvering target." The Soviet math was sound. To hit a plane with a dumb rocket in a head-on pass, the computer on the American jet would have to calculate the speed of the target, the speed of the interceptor, the wind shear, and the ballistics of the rocket perfectly. And even then, If the Soviet pilot simply banked 10 degrees to the left, the rockets would fly harmlessly into empty space. The KGB Technology Directorate began to suspect the Americans had developed a new kind of super-phase radar jamming, or perhaps a proximity fuse of unusual sensitivity. They tasked their agents in the US defense industry to dig deeper into the specifications of the weapon mounted on the Voodoo. The code name, Ding Dong, appeared in intercepted cables, a ridiculous, non-threatening name that the Americans eventually changed to Genie. The blueprints they managed to piece together only deepened the mystery. The rocket was officially designated the MB-1. It was crude, it had flip-out fins, it had a solid rocket motor. It looked like something a backyard hobbyist would build, not the apex of Western military technology. Crucially, it had no guidance wire, no infrared seeker, no radar receiver. Once it left the rail of the F-101 Voodoo, it was blind. The Soviet experts laughed. "They are building flying telephone poles," one engineer remarked at a closed-door meeting in Moscow. "They rely on the Hughes MG-13 fire control system to aim the entire airplane. If the pilot twitches, the shot misses by a mile." Confidence surged through the Soviet high command. They believed the Americans had made a strategic error. They believed the US Air Force had become so obsessed with speed, making the Voodoo the fastest fighter in the world, that they had forgotten how to fight. They assumed the collision course tactic was a bluff, a desperate measure to frighten the bomber crews with near misses. However, a few astute analysts in the GRU remained uneasy. They looked at the flight profiles again. The Voodoo pilots were disciplined. They always engaged from the front or the side, never the rear. They always broke off their attack at a specific distance, about 6 miles out. Why 6 miles? In conventional combat, you want to get close. You want to see the rivets on the enemy plane. You want to ensure the kill. Breaking off at 6 miles was leaving the battle before it started. It implied that the Americans were afraid of something, or perhaps they needed to be far away from something. The analysts looked at the specs of the Voodoo again. It was sealed against radiation. It had a retractable blast shield for the pilot's eyes. "Why does a pilot need a thermal shield to shoot down a propeller plane?" the junior analyst asked. The senior officers waved it away. "Flash protection from their own muzzle blasts," they reasoned. Or perhaps protection against the nuclear flash of a Soviet bomber detonating its payload if it crashed. The pieces of the puzzle were all there on the table in Moscow. The blind rocket, the head-on suicide run, the 6-mile breakaway, the radiation shielding. But the picture they formed was wrong, because they were looking at it through the lens of conventional warfare. They were thinking about accuracy. They were thinking about hitting a target. The Americans, meanwhile, weren't thinking about hitting a target. They were thinking about geometry. In the skies over Florida, far from Soviet prying eyes, a test pilot named Captain Simplistic was running the actual simulation. He watched his radar screen. The computer, a marvel of 1950s analog engineering, wasn't calculating a direct hit. It was calculating a detonation point in empty space. The Voodoo wasn't a sniper rifle. It was a shotgun the size of a mountain. The Soviet investigation stalled. They concluded that the F-101 Voodoo was a fast, impressive, but ultimately flawed interceptor. They advised the bomber crews that if they saw a Voodoo making a head-on run, they should simply perform a jinking maneuver, a sudden change in altitude or direction. The unguided American rockets would pass harmlessly by. Let them play with their fast toys, the Soviet generals decided. Our electronic countermeasures will blind their fire control, and their dumb rockets will hit nothing but air. It was the ultimate confirmation bias. They saw what they wanted to see, an enemy struggling with the complexities of supersonic guidance. They didn't realize that the Americans had simply bypassed the problem entirely. The trap was set. The Soviet bomber fleets were training to dodge bullets, unaware they were about to fly into a wall of fire hotter than the surface of the Sunday. The head-on attack wasn't a mistake. It was the only way for the Voodoo pilot to survive what he was about to unleash. 1961. The Zhukovsky Central Aerohydrodynamic Institute, just outside Moscow. The Soviet confidence was beginning to crack, hairline fractures appearing in their assessment of the American defenses. The source of this anxiety wasn't a spy report or a satellite photo. It was simple trigonometry. Dr. Leonid Arbatov, a specialist in blast dynamics and aerial maneuvering, stood before a chalkboard covered in white dust. He had been tasked with a very specific, odd job: reverse engineer the flight path of the F-101 Voodoo, based on radar tracks recorded near the Canadian border. "Comrades," Arbatov began, his voice dry, "we have been assuming the American pilots are breaking off their attack at 6 miles because of the range of their fire control radar. We assumed they were turning away to reset for a second pass." He drew a sharp curve on the board. "We were wrong." Arbatov traced the line of the Voodoo. The interceptor would accelerate to Mach 1.5. It would launch its weapon. And then, immediately violently, the pilot would pull the aircraft into a high G turn. 180-degree reversal. "This is not a reset," Arbatov said, tapping the chalk against the board until it snapped. "This is an escape maneuver." The room went silent. In air combat, you only run away if you are losing. But the Voodoo pilots were running away immediately after firing. "Escape from what?" a general asked, leaning forward, the medals on his chest clinking against the table. "If they fire a conventional rocket, there is no debris. There is no backlash. Why turn so hard you almost black out?" Arbatov picked up a slide rule. "I have calculated the velocity of the turn. The Voodoo is trying to put exactly 3 miles of distance between itself and the point of impact within 12 seconds. If they fly any slower, or turn any wider, the aircraft structure will be compromised." He let that sink in. Compromised. The weapon the Voodoo was firing wasn't just dangerous to the target, it was lethal to the shooter. This was the twist that turned the Soviet strategic planning on its head. Conventional high explosives, even the biggest warheads fitted to air-to-air missiles, didn't require an escape maneuver. You could shoot a sidewinder and fly right through the smoke cloud of the destroyed target. But the Voodoo was treating its own weapon like a ticking catastrophe. The thrill of the mystery shifted from, "Why are they so bad at aiming?" to, "What kind of monster are they unleashing?" The investigation moved from the aerodynamics lab to the physics department. The KGB brought in experts on shockwaves. They looked at the size of the rocket, the MB-1. It was too small to carry a massive load of TNT. You couldn't pack enough conventional chemical explosive into that small airframe to create a blast radius that would threaten the firing aircraft 3 miles away. Unless the explosive wasn't chemical. A chilling theory began to circulate through the upper echelons of the Soviet military apparatus. It was a theory so reckless, so terrifying, that many dismissed it as American propaganda. "Is it possible," a junior physicist whispered during a late-night session, "that they have miniaturized the sun?" The room laughed nervously. Atomic weapons were heavy. They were the size of cars. They belonged in the belly of a bomber, not under the wing of a fighter jet. The smallest Soviet nuclear device weighed hundreds of kilograms. To put one on a rocket? It was science fiction. But the radar tracks didn't lie. The Voodoo was a delivery truck that dropped a package and then sprinted for its life. Then came the final piece of the puzzle, the one that turned the thrill into dread. A report surfaced regarding the American Project Ding Dong. It described the fuse mechanism of the rocket. It didn't use an impact fuse. It didn't rely on hitting the metal skin of a bomber. It used a sophisticated time delay and proximity radar fuse. It was designed to detonate in empty space. The Soviet strategists looked at their formation charts. They flew their Tu-95 Bear bombers in tight cells to overlap their defensive machine gun fire. It was a defensive box, designed to protect against bullets and small missiles. But if the American weapon was designed to detonate in the center of that formation, Arbatov wiped the sweat from his forehead. He drew a circle on the chalkboard. A big circle. "If the Americans have done the impossible," he said quietly, "if they have put a nuclear warhead into an air-to-air rocket, then accuracy is irrelevant." He drew an X inside the circle. "They don't need to hit the plane, General. They just need to hit the sky." The implications were horrifying. The electronic jammers on the Soviet bombers, the pride of their defense, would be useless. You can't jam a nuclear explosion. The evasive maneuvers, the jinking and diving would be futile. You can't dodge a fireball that is 2,000 feet wide. The Voodoo wasn't a fighter. It was an executioner. The Soviet High Command stared at the board. The arrogance of the 1950s evaporated. They realized that every time they had flown near the Alaskan border, they hadn't been testing a clumsy opponent. They had been teasing a sleeping dragon that had the power to vaporize an entire squadron with a single trigger pull. The mystery was solved, but the shock was just arriving. They knew what it was likely to be, but they couldn't comprehend the sheer, raw violence of the reality until they saw the proof. And the proof existed. The Americans had actually tested it, And the footage of that test, the moment a man stood directly under a nuclear airburst just to prove it worked, was about to change the history of warfare forever. July 1957. Yucca Flat, Nevada. Operation Plum Bob. The Soviet theory was a nightmare of mathematics, but the American reality was a nightmare of physics. While the analysts in Moscow were staring at chalkboards, 5 American officers were standing in the middle of the Nevada desert, staring up at the empty blue sky. They wore no protective suits, no respirators. They wore simple summer uniforms. One of them, a colonel, held a camera. They were standing at ground zero. This was the ultimate gamble. The United States Air Force was about to prove that the weapon carried by their interceptors, the weapon the Soviets dismissed as a dumb rocket, was precise enough to kill a fleet of bombers, yet safe enough to be detonated over the heads of the population it was defending. At 18,000 feet above them, an F-89 Jules Scorpion, the predecessor and testbed for the incoming fleet of F-101 Voodoos, roared into the testing box. The pilot, Captain Eric Hutchison, watched his radar scope. He wasn't looking for a target drone, he was looking for a point in space. The weapon on his wing was the Air-2 Genie. It looked innocuous. It was 9 feet long, white, with pop-out fins. It cost about $7,000 to make the price of a nice Cadillac. But inside the nose cone was the W-25 nuclear warhead. This was the shock the Soviets had feared. The United States had successfully miniaturized a nuclear device to the size of a soccer ball. "Fire," Hutchison said. The rocket motor ignited with a flash of smoke. The Genie streaked away at Mach 3. Immediately, Hutchison threw the interceptor into that violent, high G-turn the Soviet radar operators would later puzzle over. He banked hard, the G-forces crushing him into his seat, putting the engine exhaust between his aircraft and the coming blast. He had to outrun the light. Down on the ground, the 5 officers squinted. They held their breath. 14 seconds later. It wasn't an explosion in the conventional sense. It was the birth of a star. A blinding, searing white light tore the sky open. For a fraction of a second, it was brighter than the Sunday bee. Then came the fireball. An orange-red sphere of plasma, expanding outward at supersonic speeds. It didn't form the classic mushroom cloud of dirt and debris because it was too high. Instead, it formed a perfect, terrifying donut of fire, a halo of destruction hanging in the stratosphere. The shockwave hit the ground moments later, a thunderclap that shook the desert floor, but the 5 officers remained standing. They were safe. The atmosphere had absorbed the radiation. The blast was high enough. But up there, in the kill box, it was an entirely different story. This was the reveal that would freeze the blood of every Soviet pilot who saw the classified footage. The AR-2 Genie did not kill with a shockwave alone. It killed with neutron flux. When the warhead detonated, it released a tsunami of high-energy neutrons and gamma rays. This invisible wave moved at the speed of light. It passed through aluminum. It passed through glass. It passed through steel. If a formation of Soviet Tu-95 bombers had been in that sky, the result would have been catastrophic and immediate. The pilots wouldn't have just been blown up, they would have been cooked. The radiation burst would have instantly incapacitated the crews, penetrating the cockpits and destroying their central nervous systems before they could even register the flash. But the horror went deeper. The electromagnetic pulse, or EMP, generated by the blast would have fried the vacuum tubes and sensitive electronics of every bomber within a 1,000-yard radius. The radar would go dead. The navigation systems would fail. The engines, choked by the sudden change in air pressure and density, would flame out. And then, the physical shockwave would arrive. The Soviet structural engineers had designed the Tu-95 Bear to withstand machine gun fire and perhaps a near miss from a conventional missile. They had not designed it to withstand the shearing forces of a 1.5 kiloton nuclear event. The wings of the bombers would have been snapped off like dry twigs. The fuselages would have crumpled. The brilliance of the American strategy was now undeniable. The dumb rocket didn't need to guide. It didn't need to hit the engine exhaust. It just needed to get into the neighborhood. A single F-101 Voodoo, carrying 2 Genie rockets, effectively controlled a sphere of airspace miles wide. It was no longer a sniper taking a shot, it was a god swatting a fly. When the intelligence regarding the capability of the AIR-2 Genie finally reached the Kremlin, the mood shifted from confusion to absolute operational paralysis. The bomber stream doctrine, the idea of safety in numbers, was dead. In fact, The standard Soviet tactic of flying in tight formation had just become their greatest weakness. If they flew close together to overlap their defensive guns, a single Genie rocket would wipe out the entire squadron. It was a 2-for-1 or 10-for-1 sale on destruction. The Soviet Air Force was forced to scatter. They had to space their bombers miles apart to avoid losing them all to a single interceptor. But by spacing them out, they lost their defensive crossfire, making them easy prey for conventional missiles. It was a checkmate. The F-101 Voodoo, the aircraft the Soviets laughed at for having no eyes, had become the most feared predator in the Arctic. It was the fastest operational fighter in the world, capable of doing Mach 1.7, and it carried the power to turn the mid-air environment into a nuclear furnace. For the next 25 years, the Voodoo and its successors stood guard. Thousands of Genie rockets were produced. They sat in bunkers in Canada and the northern United States, a silent, unguided arsenal waiting for the order that thankfully never came. The mystery was solved. The impossible radar tracks, the suicide runs, the blind rockets. It was all a carefully choreographed dance of nuclear physics. The Americans hadn't forgotten how to aim. They had simply realized that when you are throwing lightning bolts, you don't need to aim. The Soviet bombers never knew the Voodoo was waiting to nuke them in mid-air because the Voodoo never had to do it. The mere existence of the weapon forced the Soviet Union to abandon high-altitude mass bomber attacks entirely. They shifted their focus to intercontinental ballistic missiles, admitting silently that the sky over North America was a wall of fire they could not pass. The F-101 Voodoo was an aircraft built for a war that never happened, armed with a weapon that could not be used, to stop an enemy who dared not fly. It was the ultimate paradox of the Cold War, a weapon so terrifyingly effective that it ensured peace by promising absolute, indiscriminate destruction. And that is the terrifying legacy of the Genie. It wasn't just a rocket, it was a line drawn in the sky, written in the language of the atom, which said, "You shall not pass."